why at all shift to manual modes? Today I'm going to take you through some of the most important aspects of photography and some very important features in your camera that will make you want to explore your camera even more. And of course, not rely on the auto mode for everything. You just bought a fancy camera, but you haven't been able to go beyond the auto mode. And you tried the different settings and dials, but you're not sure what's going on. You reached out to the user manual, but you felt that you don't have the time and patience to go through another physics and mechanics chapter. Don't give up. These are some of the most common issues that new camera owners and sometimes even professionals face with new equipment. We are going to change that in the next 1 hour. Your camera is really capable of anything and everything that you see online, especially on social media. Anything that you can dream of can be captured and made into beautiful pictures. You just need a helping hand to get started in this extremely addictive world of photography. I am Ramit Batra, a mechanical engineer with a decade of experience in filmmaking and education. I was an assistant director in Bombay before starting a career as a full-time professional photographer. I've clocked more than 12 years of experience in portraits, architecture, travel, lifestyle, and destination wedding photography and films. Having covered over 500 weddings in over 14 countries, I have been very lucky to have won several awards, blog mentions, and magazine features for my work. I'm associated with some of the most popular brands in photography like Nikon, Kodox, Moza, and Seaconic as a mentor and a brand ambassador. I have been teaching photography, filmmaking, post-production, as well as the business of photography for several years. And like all of you, I love to travel, and I always try to keep at least one camera with me at all times because I feel that the best way to learn is to practice a skill all the time. That's enough about me. Today I'm going to take you through some of the most important aspects of photography and some very important features in your camera that will make you want to explore your camera even more. And of course, not rely on the auto mode for everything. The very first thing we need to understand is why at all shift to manual modes. Isn't the computer or the processor more capable of handling millions of calculations in a fraction of a second and get back to you with the settings which are possibly more accurate? The phone does it so well, so why not the camera? Well, yes and no. Yes, if you have a precise understanding of how your camera calculates light and other settings, it might be easy to switch to auto modes like Aperture Priority or Shutter Priority, or even programmable auto mode or the P mode. But more often than not, we don't want the sum of all these calculations to reflect in your photograph. For example, creating this silhouette, the camera would be screaming that this photo is underexposed if it was in auto mode. Or for example, this setup with artificial lights, where the camera knows that there is a flash involved, but since we are using off-camera flash with a manual trigger, it would not understand what settings are the best and how much light is coming in. So today, we are going to spend some time to understand what these various settings are, and not just the aperture, shutter speed or ISO, but also things like white balance, metering, autofocus modes, and the best settings for various situations. Please keep in mind that I'll be showcasing some standard camera menu items or settings that you will find in any camera brand that boasts of a manual mode, be it a DJI Mavic drone, a GoPro, or even a 360 camera, or Canon, Fuji, Nikon, anything. The next 1 hour will help you explore your camera better and in turn allow you to capture captivating photographs as creatively as you can imagine. For practical purposes, I will be using a Nikon Z7 to showcase various settings. I'm sure you'll be able to spot all the technical names and words that I'm using for your own camera as well. When we first get the camera, it is very common to just unbox it, pick it up, and start shooting. It is an exciting time for every photographer to try out new gear. But as we get comfortable with the use of the camera, we tend to start ignoring the hundreds of hidden settings that might be there to help us. So let us start by looking at what is it at the back of the camera and identify a few things first to help you view this easily. So I have connected my Nikon Z7 here with the LCD behind me. So whatever I'm going to be looking at here or whatever settings I'll be changing, it will all be visible here for you to understand. So let's first get familiar with our camera, the dials and the settings that are available. First, looking back at the monitor screen of the camera, to activate the LCD, look for the display button, something like this. So on the left side, you will see the mode. Here you can see that it is on auto mode. Right next to it, the 1/60 is the shutter speed. Right next to the shutter speed, you can see the aperture, f2.8. Underneath that is the ISO. Right next to it is the number which is showing how many pictures are left in the memory card. Underneath this is a lot of settings which we are going to talk about in detail a little later. On the top of the camera, you can see the mode dial. It has things like auto, P, A, S and M written. Auto mode is self-explanatory. It is more like a point and shoot mode. You don't need to worry about anything else. This is the mode which everybody uses to begin with. There's nothing wrong with it, but today we will talk about so much more that is available with your camera. Starting with the P or the programmable auto mode. The first thing you will notice is the switch of the indicator from auto to P. As you can see, it allows you to tweak the exposure value or how dark or light you want the scene to be. But everything else is still under the camera's control. You can control the ISO if you want to. You can leave that with the camera as well. Oh, what is exposure value? We will touch on this topic in just a minute. The next mode is the S or AV, aperture value or shutter priority mode. This is the second non-automatic mode after the P mode that I would like you to explore. This is where you set the shutter speed and let the camera do the rest. As you can see, I'm changing the shutter speed here. The third one is the A or TV, time value or aperture priority mode. Similar to the shutter priority mode, but this time you can set the aperture. As you can see, I'm changing the aperture here. The camera does all the other calculations and decides the rest. And finally, we have the M, the manual mode, where everything from the shutter speed to your ISO, everything else can be controlled by you. There are also some other modes like U1, U2, U3. These are modes which let you do certain things and save the settings in your camera, but we are going to skip that for today. To understand these modes, let us look at the exposure triangle. Here you can see on the left is the depth of field. This is controlled by the aperture. On the right is the amount of grain in your picture. That is controlled by your ISO. And at the bottom is how sharp your picture is, which is controlled by your shutter speed. Every time you click the shutter button, your camera is working some magic inside doing its best to properly expose your photograph. Exposure is the result of all these three different variables that determine if your photo is underexposed or too dark, overexposed, too bright, or evenly exposed, which is what we are going to target. The three variables that make up exposure are sensitivity, shutter speed, and aperture. Sensitivity refers to how sensitive the camera's digital sensor is to light and has been expressed as ISO. Shutter speed is measured of how long the camera sensor is exposed to light. Shutter speeds are measured in seconds or fractions of seconds, like 1 by 60 or 1 by 25. Aperture is the size of the lens opening that allows light to pass through and reach the camera's sensors. Aperture settings are often discussed in terms of f-stops. So if you hear someone say that the shot was f2 or f by 2, it means their aperture was set at 2. But what does it all mean? What is this f2.8 and f4 at f22? What is aperture actually? Look at this image. So aperture is basically an opening in front of your camera which allows light to pass through. The wider the opening or the smaller the aperture number, like 2.8, the shallower is depth of field. Now what is depth of field? Depth of field is basically what in your picture is in focus or out of focus. When you have a shallow aperture like a 2.8, it means that very little amount of things in your picture are going to be in focus. But at the same time, when you have a higher aperture like a f22, it means that your depth of field is deep. It means that you can see a lot more in focus in your picture. But what about shutter speed? What are these 1 by 125, 1 by 50 and 1 by 100? Shutter speed is basically the amount of time the shutter remains open. So 1 by 125 means that the shutter was open for 1 by 125th part of a second. That is a very small value. What does 1 by 125 actually mean? It means that the shutter was open for 1/25th part of a second. So 1 by 125 is the amount of time which the shutter remained open to allow light inside. When we need to capture something which is moving very fast or something like a sports event, your shutter speeds have to be higher, like 1 by 500, 1 by 1000, so that you can capture the moving object properly. But when you have to capture something which is very dark, let's say something post sunset or a starry night, your shutter speeds have to be very slow. In the 1 by 1 range, 1 by 1 would lead to 1 second or maybe 2 seconds or 10 seconds of exposure. At these slow speeds, your shutter remains open for a very long time and it is not possible for you to hold the camera for that long without shaking it. So these slow shutter speeds call for a tripod. And what about EV or exposure value that I spoke about earlier? So exposure value is nothing but the sum of ISO, aperture and shutter speed. When your scene or your frame is correctly exposed, your EV or exposure value is going to show 0. 0 means it is neither overexposed nor underexposed. At the same time, when your exposure value is +1 or +2 or something in the plus range, it shows how many stops of light are coming in the camera which are in addition to a normally exposed scene. So we are going to look at +1 and +2 values when we want an additionally bright scene. And when we are looking at values of -1 or -2, we are looking at an underexposed scene. So if aperture and shutter speed both control the amount of light that is coming in the camera, by working in different ways, aperture increasing or decreasing the size of the hole, which allows the light to come in, and the shutter speed controlling the amount of light that comes in by opening or closing the shutter, or by controlling the amount of time the sensor is exposed to the light that comes in. What does the ISO do? Again, ISO also controls the amount of light that is captured. A higher ISO number, like a 1600 or 3200, allows more light to be captured in the sensor, or it's more sensitive towards light, but at the expense of noise. The higher the ISO number, it is technically creating more noise, due to which it is actually sensitive towards light. So we now have a brief understanding of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and how all of these three factors control the amount of light that we want to capture, or the exposure of the particular frame. So that was a lot of technical information. We are going to revisit that soon. Moving on, let us look at the other buttons that are available in our camera. On the top right, we have the shutter release button, the ISO button, and the plus minus button, or the exposure compensation button. The other two most important dials are the main command dial, this wheel that we have on the right top of most cameras, and this sub command dial. Typically, we use the thumb to scroll through the main command dial, and it allows us to change the shutter speed. And the sub command dial allows us to change the aperture with the index finger, or even the middle finger if you like to keep your index finger on the shutter button. To change the ISO, we need to hold the ISO button and then move the main command dial. All mirrorless or DSLR cameras will have at least two dials which control the aperture and shutter speed, an ISO button, and a button for exposure compensation adjustment. If you have a new camera and you are not able to figure out how to go about all these dials and settings, don't worry. There are always multiple ways to do the same thing when it comes to technology. Just activate the touchscreen of your camera display while in settings mode, and you would be able to touch and change the settings as required, just like this. Or the aperture, or the ISO. The bottom layer is a set of 12 more items. The first one being picture control. Picture control decides the hues and tones based on the type of scene that you are shooting. It is great when you are saving as JPEG, as it allows you to see the final output right there in the screen. Let us have a look at various options available. You have auto, which of course gives the camera full control on what kind of scene it has to capture. Then you have standard and neutral, and vivid, for example, allows for oversaturated greens and blues. Then you have monochrome, which is just black and white. Portrait mode has the truest form of skin tones. So if you're shooting a lot of portraits, or if you're shooting weddings, portrait mode is a great mode to use. Landscape, again, as the name suggests, allows you to capture the greens and blues properly. Unlike the portrait mode, the emphasis is on greens, blues, and the overall sharpness of the scene. Then we have the flat profile, which actually pushes the darks and pulls down the whites. So it actually makes for a very flat, non-contrasty picture. It is great when you have to do a lot of post-production on your photographs or films, as it allows you to see the real content of the picture, and you can take care of the colors and the details later in post-production. So most of the mirrorless cameras these days can connect to your phone or your computer directly via Wi-Fi. So you can actually do all these edits in the camera and just directly post it on Instagram and social media. So that is really exciting. Our next setting is white balance. White balance, or WB, is the process of removing unrealistic color casts so that objects which appear white are truly shown white in your pictures. Proper camera white balance has to take into account the color temperature of the light source, which refers to the relative warmth or coolness of white light. Our eyes are very good at judging what is white under different light sources, but digital cameras often have a great difficulty with auto white balance or AWB, and they can create unsightly blue, orange, or even green color casts. Understanding digital white balance can help you avoid these color casts, thereby improving your photos under a wide range of lighting conditions. As you can see here, we have different settings which are more like presets which we use a lot, like direct sunlight, cloudy, shade, incandescent, and flash. So all these are different Kelvin temperatures which I have just shown you in the color chart. If you want more control on white balance, there is a choose color temperature option, or the K option, which actually allows you to choose what specific color tone or white balance you require for that particular scene. Here, as you can see, I can choose the white balance. I can set it to, let's say, 5500, which is close to daylight, and give it a magenta or a green cast as well, depending on where I'm shooting, or if there is a green cast coming from a tree. So all these things can be manipulated in the K mode, or the manual white balance mode. The best or the easiest way to see is when you are in the K mode or in the manual Kelvin temperature white balance mode, you can just scroll through different white balances, increase or decrease the amount of temperature, and you can actually see the change in your scene in real time. For example, this image, if I slide the white balance towards the left or make it warmer, this image becomes orange. And if I push it towards the right, this image starts to become bluer. So these are the kind of things you can do in your camera and actually get the kind of look that you want to achieve. So the next setting that we have here is quality. So the image quality depends on RAW or JPEG, and there are different options here. What does RAW mean, or what does JPEG mean? RAW files are uncompressed files saved by the camera, and JPEG files are compressed small sized files saved by the camera with the standard or the vivid or those picture controls that we spoke about pasted on those pictures. The JPEG files are small in size, whereas the RAW files are much larger in size because they hold a lot of information. The advantages of RAW files over JPEG is that RAW files have a lot of data. RAW files are big in size. They're almost twice the size of a JPEG file, so they take up a lot of space, but they store a lot of information. Let's say if you want to change a little bit of white balance, or if you want to increase or decrease a little bit of exposure, you can do all that later in post-production in a RAW file. The JPEG files are more compressed and packed and edited files. They have sharpness added on it, they have saturation added on it. So JPEG files are small in size, easy to handle. They are great if you want to just use that JPEG file and post it on Instagram or social media. But at the same time, you cannot do a lot of editing on JPEG files as they're already compressed, they already have a lot of loss of data. So what do we do? What do we choose? Do we choose JPEG or do we choose RAW? See, we typically choose RAW files when we are shooting weddings or commercial assignments because we always have to do a little bit of post-production later. You can choose JPEG files if you don't want to put those files on a computer and do post-production. Let's say if you're traveling and you quickly want to take some pictures, send it to your family, post it on Instagram or social media, I think JPEG is ideal for that. But if you don't have any limitations of space, or if you have memory cards which are 256 GBs or the large ones, you can actually save in JPEG and RAW at the same time. As you can see here, I'm saving in full RAW and a normal sized JPEG. This gives me the best of both worlds. I can take these files, take them on my computer, do a little bit of post-production on it. But at the same time, if I'm traveling or if I'm in a hurry, if I have to give like a preview to a client, I can quickly transfer the JPEG files to my phone. I can do a little bit of tweaking and quickly send it on WhatsApp or upload it on Instagram. So my recommendation would be to use a RAW and a JPEG combination whenever you are shooting. Our next setting is image size. Now, image size is pretty self-explanatory. It allows you to increase or decrease the size of your RAW files and probably have a small, medium or large JPEG along with it. In my recommendation, there is no reason why you should not save your files in the maximum size possible. I mean, why would you want to save pictures in a smaller size? So it is pretty basic, I think. Use this setting to increase your size to the max and always save the highest size or the largest size possible. All right, our next setting is flash mode. We are not going to be touching the flash mode at this particular webinar because it's a very advanced topic. So to give you a quick download of what this says is, if you have flash on or if you don't have the flash on, it is basically telling your camera if you're using an external or a pop-up flash, or if you're not going to be using a flash. Most of the mirrorless or DSLR cameras that we use now don't have a pop-up flash on top. Most of the user or amateur cameras have a pop-up flash, so this setting actually becomes quite important there. But here, when we don't have a pop-up flash and when we have to use an external flash and we have to use a trigger or a remote trigger, it actually makes it more complex to get into this setting. So we are not going to get into it and move to the next one. Our next option is metering. Now, metering is one of those extremely complex things which when I was growing as a photographer, maybe about 15 years ago, it used to be one of those most difficult things to understand. So I'm going to talk about metering in the best way possible so that you don't face the same difficulties. The first, as you can see, is matrix metering or evaluative metering. In certain cameras, this is your auto mode. It takes into account tonality, color, composition, distance of the subject, and does a calculation to make sure that the picture is as close to what I can see without the use of a camera. This is great for most scenes where there is not too much variation in the subject light or background, such as overcast days or landscapes. The next one is center-weighted metering. It is similar to matrix metering, but the preference is given to the center of the frame and not any other specific subject location. This is ideal for portraits when your subject is centered, or for example, you want to capture a landscape during sunset. The center of weighted metering would allow you to look at and emphasize on the colors of the sun rather than the entire scene to be lit up and the sun faded out. The next one is spot metering. Spot metering is the mode that I use the most. The camera uses about 1 to 1.5% of the area around the focus point. This is ideal if you want to pay attention only to the subject and not worry about the bright or dark background. The next one is highlight weighted metering. Highlight weighted metering, to put it simply, this is a mode which will detect the brightest spot in your frame, and this will make sure that it is properly lit. This is great for events like stage performances where there is a spotlight on a dancer and it is very difficult to focus on that particular dancer. So you just use this mode and it will allow you to capture it properly. Our next setting is Wi-Fi connection. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. All these mirrorless cameras can connect to the Wi-Fi, and through the Wi-Fi they can connect to your phone or your laptop or your computer. So you can use this mode when you want to take self-portraits, or you can use this mode to connect to your phone and transfer the pictures. And you can even use this mode similar to what I'm doing. You can actually control the settings of your camera through your mobile phone. You can change your shutter speed, aperture, and all the other settings. So this is pretty important with all the new cameras that we have. And you should definitely explore using your mirrorless camera or your DSLR with your phone through the Wi-Fi connection mode. Coming to our next mode, it's called active delighting. So a lot of cameras have inbuilt settings wherein you can modify the darks and the bright areas of a particular frame. Active delighting is more of an automatic setting in which it brings up all the dark areas and pulls down all the light areas to make the picture more uniformly lit. Here is an example. This is without delighting, and this one is with delighting. And there is a third one in which delighting is set to high. As you can see, this is bringing out all the dark areas really well, and all the bright areas are also pulled down, so you can see a little bit of detail there. The next setting that we have is release mode. Now, release mode has to do more of what happens when you click the shutter button. As you can see, here it says single frame. What that means is when you press the shutter button, the camera is going to record one picture, and that's it, just one frame. Then we have a continuous L, which is a low continuous kind of recording. Here what the camera does is it keeps capturing frames. For example, 2 FPS means every second, if you keep holding the shutter button, the camera is going to keep capturing 2 frames per second. The continuous H, as the name suggests, it allows you to save at a very high speed. So let's say it will save at 6 or 7 FPS depending on your camera. And then you have the continuous H extended. So what this means is that it will keep recording as long as you're holding the shutter button for an extended period of time. It will keep going on even when the buffer of the camera gets full. It will still try to capture some more images. So it is going to go on capturing for a longer period of time. And then you have the self-timer modes. Now, these are really important when you're doing self-portraits. So you can set a self-timer, and then you can allow the camera to know how many pictures you want after the timer is over. You can set it to 1 if you just want one portrait, or you can set it into a burst of 4 or 5 pictures. You can change how long you want the camera to be on self-timer. Let's say 20 seconds or maybe 2 seconds. Release mode is really important in certain situations like sports or weddings. Let's say if there is a very important moment happening, you don't want to just capture one frame, but you want to capture many different frames for a longer period of time. So we typically use the continuous H mode a lot. It typically captures in about 5 or 6 frames per second on a Z7. So it allows me to capture for maybe 4 or 5 seconds, and it gives me so many pictures which I can choose from. Certain fast actions like sports, you cannot actually pinpoint when a good picture or when a good movement is going to happen. So it is very important that you capture in multiple picture mode or burst mode, as it is referred to in certain cameras. So this is kind of my favorite setting. I just generally put it on continuous H. But if you're shooting portraits or if you're shooting landscapes, you can actually switch back to just a single frame, and you can reframe, reset the whole camera focus and everything, and then capture it again. So different settings allow you to capture different kind of scenes, and it is very important to understand what you are capturing. There is no point capturing a landscape in a high burst mode because you're going to just end up with the same picture in multiple copies of the same picture. The next mode is vibration reduction. Vibration reduction is a mechanical process which allows the camera to compensate for hand movement or the little movement that we have even when we are holding the camera really steady. So that is vibration reduction. I always set it to normal on. And if you have vibration reduction in your camera, you should just set it to on. Our next setting is autofocus area. Autofocus area refers to the size of the focus point. Even while we want you to start using manual controls, it is not at all necessary to use manual focus. Unless for a very specific scene, let's say for landscape or products or for certain photo or video shots, we want you to avoid using the manual mode here. Which means understanding of the automatic modes is extremely important. Let's start with the pinpoint AF. Use this mode for stationary subjects. Focus on a selected spot within the frame. Single point AF or AFS. Use this mode when accurate focus is crucial for stationary subjects. Wide area AF or AFS. Use this mode for stationary or moving subjects when their exact position in the frame is less precise. Wide area AF is used for capturing stationary or moving subjects, especially those moving subjects that are hard to keep in a frame using a smaller or a single point. Use this for areas which are wider than the small area. And finally, the auto area AF. This allows the camera to judge what is the specific area that needs focusing. Sometimes it is autofocus on the face, sometimes it is autofocus on the moving subject. It allows the camera to decide whether it needs eye detection or face detection, or whether it is just a moving subject that needs to be captured. Alright, so you've made it through 11 settings, and this is the final one. This is called focus mode. Now, focus mode is fairly simple. It allows you to tell the camera whether you want a single AF or a continuous AF. What does single AF mean? Single AF means single autofocus. So you just press the shutter button and the camera focuses once on that particular scene. Once the focus is locked, that's it. You can take the picture and you can move the finger away. But if you have somebody who's moving, or if you have a subject which is, for example, in a sports scene, if the subject is moving around, once you focus lock using the AFS or a single AF mode, and the subject has already moved, the camera does not understand whether it needs to refocus until or unless you remove the finger and then press the shutter button again for focusing. And by that time again, the subject would have moved a distance. In that particular case, we use the continuous AF mode. What continuous AF mode does is it allows the camera to understand that the subject is moving and it has to capture that subject in a continuous fashion. So it has to keep throwing those beams or calculations and keep capturing that focus length all the time. Now that you have a fair idea about the various settings and options that we can control in the camera, some of them allow us to capture certain tricky situations better. Like shooting in RAW format helps us do some tweaks in the pictures later. Or shooting in burst mode allows us to capture fast action But the crux of it all is understanding how we can capture light properly. So let us look at exposure in detail. What is exposure that we keep talking about? In the simplest of words, exposure refers to how bright or how dark your image is. Every camera has this little scale in the viewfinder, which keeps giving you the final calculation of the exposure of that particular image as per the camera's processor. The plus here means that the image is overexposed or has too much light. The minus, as you can see in this frame, means the image is underexposed because the background here is really dark. The zero here is for perfect exposure. There is no way for the camera to tell for sure whether the image is perfectly exposed or not, as per what you require, which is where the whole point of using manual control comes into the play. Now, mathematically, it is extremely important to understand this correlation. Every time we change any one setting, like aperture, shutter speed, or ISO, we change the overall exposure of the image. So if we want to compensate and keep the exposure same, we need to change one of the other two settings at the same time. For example, let us start by what is on my camera. As you can see, my shutter speed is 1/125, aperture is 2.8, ISO is 400, and the exposure here is pushing towards negative. See, I have a very dark foreground here, so naturally the exposure is not sufficient. The camera is saying that the light is not sufficient, it's too low. So what are we going to do? I am going to boost the ISO. I have doubled the ISO, but still there is no change in the exposure. So I'm going to keep going on and on. So almost at ISO 20,000, I am able to get the exposure value to 0, which means that the scene was really dark. But is ISO 20,000 good? Won't it be too much noise in the picture? So what should I do? So I'm going to dial this back. As you can see, every time I click, the exposure value changes by 1/3 stop. So I have clicked 6 times right now. So what I need to do here at shutter or aperture is I need to change 6 clicks or 6 1/3 stops to get to the same exposure value. So let us do that by changing the shutter speed. Alright, so now this is also at perfect exposure. Now can I change something else? I can actually pull the shutter speed still lower. As you can see, it is increasing now, which allows me to decrease my ISO. Now this is an acceptable exposure set, 1/10. I am on a tripod, so I'm going to be pretty stable. Aperture is 2.8. I cannot go below it. This is a 24-70 2.8 lens. So this is already at its max. Then we have ISO 1600. So now this is a great example of what an image setting can look like. Now this is also giving me a perfect exposure. Now what if this was a sports event? Now I would not be able to capture a sports event in this kind of a setting because I would need a very high shutter speed. Let's say 1/400 or 1/500. And what do I need to do? I cannot change the aperture. I'll have to increase the ISO. So I'll have to go to some extremely high ISOs, which might not be possible in other DSLRs or mirrorless cameras. This allows me to go beyond 1,20,000 and stuff like that. But this is not at all acceptable. This is just an example that it is possible to get an exposure setting by changing different variations of your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. Now, what if this was a landscape? Now, in a landscape, I need a lot of depth. I need everything to be in focus. So what I need to do first is change the aperture, let's say to f8. Now my exposure value has again gone down below. So what I'm going to do is, I don't need a very high shutter speed like I said. So what I'll do is, I'll reduce the shutter speed to 1/80. Now what is the other thing which I can change? I need to change the ISO. I'm at, I don't know, 1 lakh or 2 lakh ISO. I need to change that substantially. So this is 25,600 ISO. I'm going to 10,000. So about 1600 is pretty much the max I generally use. So now again I've gone back to a blinking negative, which means my exposure values is at least 3 or 4 stops below what is required. So what I can do again is reduce the shutter speed. Like I said, we are shooting a landscape and I'm on a tripod, so stability is not going to be an issue. But if you look at this, to get an approximately perfect exposure, my shutter speed is now 1 second. So this is what I'm talking about. These are the variations that one needs to understand to get to know what kind of exposures, what kind of apertures or shutter speeds or ISOs one needs during what kind of scenes. So as you can see, there are hundreds of combinations of aperture, shutter speed and ISO to get the same exposure. But what exposure and what different variation works for your particular scene is what makes you a great photographer. Alright, so now let us look at some more examples of photographs that I've captured. Let us look at their different settings from ISO to shutter speed to aperture, and even if I used any other variety of other settings that we discussed earlier. And let's see how that affected the particular scene. Hope these pointers added to your knowledge of photography and handling the camera. The more you practice, the more familiar you will get with these controls. Knowing the camera controls and settings allows you to focus on the frame in front of you and opens up endless opportunities to shoot the same creatively. This is Ramit Batra signing out. Thank you for taking time out to go through your camera. Do share your photographs on Instagram with the hashtag GetBetterWithRamit to let us know that it helped you in any way possible. It would be my pleasure to view your photographs and chat about it. Stay safe, stay connected.